Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the children's pastor here, but I started out as you. My first church service here was Easter Sunday 2012, and that's where God got a hold of my heart. They acted out the scene on the cross, and they nailed a pretend Jesus, someone acting out Jesus on the cross, and it kind of freaked me out a little bit, but it stuck with me the rest of that Easter Sunday, and I was like, I want to come back even though this is kind of weird. So that's where it began. I had decided I had loved Jesus before I really even understood what it meant to be saved. So probably about 2013, I asked Jesus in my heart, but besides, oh, Jesus died on the cross for me, that's wonderful, I didn't really understand it until the weekend before I left for college, my last Sunday here before. I was very nervous. We had a guest speaker, and he had an altar call and said, if you want to follow Jesus and you are going to be bold and say you will never turn your back on Jesus, please come up to the altar. And that was the first time I had ever done anything like that. So I went up to the altar and I got prayed for, and that person who had been bringing me to church, who I'm not related to, I remember she was like crying as she had her arms around me, and I was like kind of taken off guard by that because she's not a crier. And it was like this beautiful moment, and that is when I celebrate asking Jesus into my heart. And then I went off to school where I was getting my biology degree. I had my whole life figured out, I had thought. Wanted to be a wildlife officer for a really long time. And then 3 weeks before graduation, God spoke to me one day and said, you're called to ministry. You should be a pastor. And I remember thinking, it's 3 weeks until graduation. Like, that can't happen. So I had a roommate. I told her, I'm like, I think God just called me to ministry. And I remember her head, like her eyes bugged out of her head, and she's like, well, what are you gonna do? And I said, I'm gonna ignore it. It's 3 weeks till graduation. So I graduated. It was wonderful. Started to become a substitute teacher and went to the police academy, and I loved it. So yes, I've been tased, I've been pepper sprayed, all that fun stuff. And it felt like I was on track. And then January 5th, 2020, in the middle of the police academy, I was working out with a friend, and my left arm and left leg went dead in the middle of the workout. I remember looking down at my fingers and telling them to move, and they would not move, and it was terrifying. So I get to the hospital, and we thought it was probably like a pulled back muscle somehow affecting this. And the nurse goes, well, you're probably not having a stroke because you're 23, but I'm gonna send you back to neuro so we can get all that rolled out right away. And that saved my life, because 30 minutes later, they had found the brain bleed in my brain and said, you've had a stroke, your brain is bleeding, we're gonna fly you to either Grant or Riverside. And I remember panicking, and my dad stepping out in the hallway and making phone calls, and I just thought, I'm gonna die. This is happening, I'm 23 years old, and there were nurses rushing in, it was very crazy. And I got down to Riverside, and I was there for 4 days. And I had brain surgery there, again at 23 years old. So they told me that I could not go back and be a police officer. And I refused to accept that answer. And then I had this moment where God spoke to me clear as day, and he said, you can keep chasing this dream and putting yourself on the throne. And you'll be miserable, but you can do that. Or you can put me on the throne and accept a call to ministry. And I was so miserable at that point, I knew I'm gonna have to give up my plans. And I cried and cried and cried because I didn't want to do it. And I remember calling my spiritual mentor, the person who had brought me to church many years ago, and I said, can I even serve in kids ministry again when I feel so broken, so depressed? And she's like, yes, because we're all broken. You can still serve there as long as you know where you're at. And then a few months later, I was sitting in another sermon, Pastor Greg was preaching, and I felt God, plain as day, say, you're gonna be a children's pastor. And at that point I had thought, maybe I'll go into like Christian education, something like that. And I just like, no, you're a children's pastor. And I remember not listening to another word he said and just thinking, God just called me to something else, and I know what happens when you don't listen. So I went to school, got my master's degree in ministry, started leading here in Kensington in our kids ministry, and eventually took a different job here as the children's pastor, and it has been the most amazing thing that has happened in my life. But I started out as you. I was just like you. I was here, I just came on Sundays, I started serving, started learning about Jesus, and that was it. I didn't work here, I didn't know I was going to be called to ministry. I just loved Jesus and knew I needed to be here. And then that changed. And it all started with an invite to Easter Sunday and coming to church, just like you.